Welcome to the first River Rock podcast. Today, we're with Dr. Nathan Brown with a great discussion on spirituality, neurofeedback, operant conditioning, and unlearning learned helplessness. Let's get to it. All right, so I am here with Dr. Nathan Brown, neurofeedback expert. At least that's how I know you, and clinical psychologist. What else? Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about your background, and then we'll leap into some interesting discussions we've had brewing in the background for a while.
Sure, you bet. I do neurofeedback. That's absolutely the case. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist out here on the West Coast, up in Seattle. And my background has basically been fairly broad. I have a training in community psychology, community and clinical, so I have kind of a framework around doing prevention. And in my career, that's kind of taken me both in the direction of neurofeedback, looking at prevention-oriented things we can do from a biological standpoint, but also organizational and system broader influences on human beings. I've done a good bit of organizational consultation. And that is certainly, both of those have kind of moved me into the direction of looking at how to work with folks both in the traditional clinical senses, but also in terms of things that would relate to spirituality and ritual, as I think we're going to discuss today.
Yeah. I think it was interesting as, obviously I met you through MindLift and learning about neurofeedback. But I think it was interesting how some of the concepts I've read on spirituality and those kinds of things kind of cropped up in those discussions, and inevitably, are modes of being that make neurofeedback more effective. Mm-hmm. And that's something I've just been super interested in for a while, because spirituality and those types of topics are the things that modern medicine is just not very comfortable dealing with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet they may be necessary for improvement in yes. a variety of different domains.
Yes.
So if we cut ourselves off from the thing that makes things work, then that can be a problem.
Yes. It's also the case, I'm a little older than you, Zain, and I can think back to when I was in graduate school, and things were, if anything, a bit worse back in those days. I went to school at a time when much of psychology actually was indifferent at best and perhaps hostile to spirituality.
Really?
Not wanting really to attend to that as a legitimate area of study. I went to a school specifically because I wanted to be able to integrate a spiritual perspective with a psychological perspective, and picked up a degree in theology along the way to kind of help with that. And interestingly, at the same time, in much of psychology, while there was lip service and to the physiological side of human beings, and we had to take courses in physiological psychology and so forth, but it really rarely went beyond almost more of a metaphorical nod to the importance of our physiology. Nowadays, we can get very, very specific about a biopsychosocial perspective on human relations. So I'm happy to be practicing now. I think there has been some growth, but we have a long way to go.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. I guess, we all have these images of past times where we were not present, right? And probably made more rosy by the reports of some of our mentors or yeah. However they perceived those times. Yeah, I guess so many of maybe we should be more careful about that. So many of my colleagues in medicine bemoan, the fact that we're not practicing in the 60s and 70s,
yeah,
because of HMOs and reimbursement. But
that's another whole
yes,
podcast,
that's a whole different thing.
It? Yes,
that's right.
The science fiction author William Gibson, he said that the future is here, it just isn't evenly distributed. And that was my experience in Southern
Sure.
California. You could see, lots of, peace, love, brotherhood, spirituality, going on in the culture. But I'm kind of referring more to academic psychology, and academic training at the time was it was not fully evenly distributed into those spheres.
I guess and that's a great segue actually. In some ways, I think one of the in terms of my background, I was a philosophy major in undergrad, and very much viewed and continue to view medicine as sort of applied real world philosophy. That was it's very easy to be philosophical in the ivory tower, but in the trenches, you get a very different view. Having been raised around cousins who are very religious, exceedingly religious. Exceedingly, that's maybe a value judgment, but very religious. I certainly have seen how it affects them, and then the writings of Khalil Gibran, even E.E. Cummings to a degree, some of the poets that seem to have some spiritual insight that defied sort of Western philosophy. The quote, paradox is truth standing on her head to gain attention. And then the book, The Spirituality of Imperfection, was probably one of the huge influences I found out of the Alcoholics Anonymous literature, and I've talked about that elsewhere. But I think the reason that book in particular resonated with me is that the early alcoholics felt that the deficiency was spiritual. The difficulty they were having was a spiritual difficulty. And it became very much a matter of life or death for them to figure out a spiritual answer. So I think from that perspective, and then pulling it into practice, talking with patients, we all have that. A lot of the angst that is experienced that we now pathologize or medicalize as anxiety or depression or whatever else has some spiritual component, that there is a stance, a way of being, a way of interpreting events that we have lost by divorcing ourselves from a spiritual viewpoint.
Interesting you'd refer to poets, because I think there is a rich tradition of those perspectives among poets. I'm thinking of Edwin Arlington Robinson is what I would think of as a existential poet, and kind of adjacent to existential psychologists and theologians who would kind of look at the idea. This would maybe be a related approach to what you're describing. The perspective of basic anxiety, that there's an anxiety that comes simply from existing, that drives a number of the problems in living that human beings have. I think that's a very valuable perspective. The whole notion that choice is inevitable, not to choose is to choose, and that for some psychologists that's what's driving that. Yeah.
And we had in previous conversation alluded to the idea of free will, and that is, I do think that drives a great deal of the anxiety, because if you have, I talk endlessly with my friends in physics who are traditional materialist atheists.
Yes.
That getting rid of free will is a very dangerous sort of enterprise, right? Because you need moral responsibility, and no one actually believes it, right? In life, you can promote certain views, but that's not how you live. And so I think the challenge of free will is exactly that, is now I have to make choices. Now I'm responsible for choices that in some, however small or however big, change the universe, right? The spiritual concepts there is almost a godlike power, is the power to change the universe, and however small a part. If I wear a blue shirt or I wear scrub top or the universe is slightly different in those scenarios, right? And there is some anxiety with being handed that power/responsibility. Especially if things aren't going the way you want. Then the question is, well, to what degree have I contributed to
Yes.
things not going the way I want?
Yes. It's interesting as you were talking, you were moving back and forth between the phrase free will and choice. And to my way of thinking, in some of the research that I did back in my graduate days, that becomes a really important distinction. We don't have free will in the sense that I can decide to fly, right? Or
Correct.
I can decide that you're going to do X. I actually don't have control over that. But there are things that we can have choice about, right? That we can make choices about. And I think that's a really important distinction. It's one that psychological research has backed up around the whole idea of efficacy. That probably the single most demonstrated finding in psychological research is that resilience in mental health depends in large part on our capacity for self-efficacy. Which is to say, the belief that, based on experience, that there are choices I can make in my life that will move the needle in a positive direction for me. Mm-hmm. If you have that belief, and it's not Pollyanna, it's based on experience, based on previous choices, then you have great power in any situation. You don't have perfect power, but you have great range of power. But what that requires is a recognition of what can I control and what can't I control. Kind of the St. Francis of Assisi prayer. You used the phrase the other day, there's a liminal space, between focusing on what I can control and what I can't, and letting go of the other. I find that a dynamic that shows up in literally every therapy case that I have. And interestingly enough, even in neurofeedback, in terms of the process of learning how to self-regulate.
Yeah, I think that gives good language. Maybe I have always considered free will, when I use that term, to not be omnipotence. I guess the way I use free will is overlapping with the way you use choice, and I would use omnipotence for a completely free will, I guess, or a limitless will.
Yeah, if not psychosis in some form.
Sure. But yeah, I do think that is a tremendous difficulty I also run into with many of my patients who have anxiety, and in some ways the one core of that anxiety is wishing the world were other than it is. Mm-hmm. And then trying to choose on the basis of a world that doesn't actually exist.
Yes.
Which is obviously futile, and then feels futile, and then reinforces anxiety and depression, I think.
Yes.
And so accepting that the situation is what it is, and that the process of changing it will be stepwise, based on the resources you have or the options you have available.
Yes.
Rather than, and I wonder if social media has an effect there in showing us other people's choices or other people's option sets. Well, this person can choose to go on a yacht to Monaco or whatever, and they have that set of choices, and I wish I had that set of choices. Right. Rather than focusing on, well, I have this set of choices, which among these will lead me in a direction that I would like to go.
Every one of these topics could be its own conversation, because I think you're right that you do get a peek into other people's kind of their scope of how they perceive their choices through social media. But on the other hand, it's curated. All of those
of course
persona that they put out. And I work with patients who have a very distorted view of what they should be able to experience. They're perhaps even entitled to experience based on what they've seen.
Yes. No, I've run into that quite a bit as well. And it's not just social media too. I think sometimes even in real life, people, whatever, if you have a friend who is significantly older and further along in life, maybe, right? Or a friend who started out life with with wealthier parents, right. And now you have come into their circle, And it's very easy to start perceiving their choices. Well, why should they have those choices and I only have these choices, right?
Right.
Um,
And of course, at some level, that's a social justice question. It's a legitimate social justice question more broadly. Yes.
It is fascinating though, and I talk about this with my mom quite a bit. She has a rather absurd story. My mom's story is sort of one you could kind of make a movie about it if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So she was a refugee twice from the two different India-Pakistan wars. So family moved to East Pakistan, then the East-West Pakistan war happened, and then my grandmother literally sold the family heirlooms to buy her a one-way ticket to New York. And the person who was supposed to meet her by letter in those days did not choose to show up. So we talk about these ideas of how unfair that set of circumstances was. But she was always rabidly focused on just what was the next best choice, right? The fairness of her set of choices, she didn't really have time to think about, right? And this past 4th of July, a lot of the social justice kind of, some of the anti-American sentiment, some of those things. My mom is rabidly pro-American. I mean, there's no patriot like an immigrant. Like it just,
Right.
and she's like, America took me in when my own country kicked me out, right? And gave me opportunity that was not available. Now, was it a fair opportunity? Did I have the same opportunity as an adult white male there? No, but I had more opportunity than I did there. And it was and we talk about this concept a lot, a winnable game. Now,
Yes.
I had to work 120 hours a week to win, and maybe he only had to work 50 hours a week to win. But I didn't care. It was winnable. In Pakistan, I could work 120 hours a week and get nowhere, right?
Yes.
And so the standard of winnability versus the standard of equal winnability, I think, are some interesting challenges from social media. We're not all going to have equal winnability, right?
Yeah.
And that, my med school classmates have always been a bit annoyed that I never really had to go to class. Like, and there's an inequality there. Like, I absorb information faster. Now, part of that's practice. I actually deliberately took speed reading courses as a kid.
Yeah.
Whatever. But there's also a native intelligence that I did not earn in any way.
Yeah.
And there's an unfairness there to our experiences of med school. They all got through. But was it fair? I don't know.
I like that phrase, the kind of the winnable idea that you just shared, because sometimes in politics we talk about the idea that there should be equality of opportunity. There may not be equality in terms of background, but equality of opportunity. What you're talking about with the winnable idea, I think, is even more useful. In a way, I think you're talking about optimizing the evolutionary selection pressure from a psychological evolutionary psych standpoint. Yeah, the poor person in Pakistan who can't win no matter what. Evolution is, he's out of the game, so to speak.
Yes.
The person in the U.S. who's maybe highly privileged and never had to work, there's a problem with evolutionary selection pressure there.
Correct.
But that winnable game, I like that idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting challenge there is you may have. Does equality of opportunity equate to equality of effort? And I'm not sure that it does.
No.
And it's interesting biologically, and I get into this discussion a lot. Something that's not that it needs to be talked about, but it's an interesting perspective is that across species, but including humans, the male neonatal death rate is significantly higher, right? And part of that is that the male mutation rate is higher. And that is part of the evolutionary advantage of sexual dimorphism, is we're going to have a slightly genetically conserved group, and then we're going to play it fast and loose with another group and let them sort into and compete
Yeah.
and take risk and sort themselves by fitness so that we keep evolving to the
Yep.
environment as it changes, right? So that duality between a conservative, protected group and a Aces Wild, high-risk group, part of the reason we evolution sort of, once it found that strategy, it latched on and really kind of continued, is because that provides both stability and experimentation. But that's not fair to either side, particularly if you are in the high-risk experimentation group and you don't want to be. Well,
Yes.
you didn't, evolution didn't give you a choice. But likewise, if you're in the, protection is always oppression in some sense.
And
if you're in the
evolution is
protected
not
group-
fair. Almost by
Evolution is not
definition,
fair.
evolution is not fair. Yes.
Correct. And we can try to do better. I mean, in terms of our moral impulses. I'm not saying that evolution is destiny either, but you have to wake up pretty early in the morning to overcome evolutionary forces. That's a challenge.
I like that.
Yeah.
One of
go
the things we talked about the other day, just to kind of talk about the neurological side of this, is that in neurofeedback and neurofunctionality, there's a good bit of attention being paid nowadays to large-scale networks that operate in the brain, large-scale networks that light up under certain conditions. So there is an attentional network, essentially, that lights up when you're being vigilant, right, or you're scanning for novel information, that kind of thing. There is something called the default network, which actually has to proactively light up in order for you to be able to do nothing, quote unquote. What I mean by nothing is in order for slow wave activity to enter in and rest and repair to take place. If that doesn't light up, you'll experience that as anxiety and you're never able to calm down, right? So there are these different networks that light up. One of the networks, and I should say that there are many different theories around this. It's based on statistical models, actually, that can get quite complicated. And so you get different ways of looking at functionality in the brain. But one of the networks that appears to be evident is something that they initially called the placebo network. And I have come to refer to it as the expectancy network. And this is a network that lights up when, for any of a variety of reasons that we'll come back to, you develop an expectancy of a positive outcome. And the interesting thing about that network, when it lights up, is it makes all the other networks function more effectively. So if I bring this down from the abstract to kind of a practical example, if you have that expectancy network light up, you're going through your day possibly seeing positive opportunity for yourself that you would not have seen without that. Absent that expectancy network lighting up, you would be, maybe you're an anxious person or somewhat depressed person, and you're just kind of, pulled into yourself and you just don't even see it. That's one of the things that happens in depression, for instance. If we literally don't see opportunity, we don't see choices that we would otherwise see. So, to my way of thinking, this is an interesting neurophysiological aspect of this, that there are actual parts of the brain that activate in ways that, in my way of thinking, this supports free choice or free will, depending on the terminology that we're going to use. It's being able to light up that particular network. And, that leads to... it leads to a lot of interesting things. A positive therapeutic relationship, if you're a psychotherapist or a physician, that seems to be one of the things that lights up this network. So that's just trying to bring in the part of the biopsychosocial aspect. Yeah.
So because everyone talks about the importance of the therapeutic relationship, but that may be interesting as a mechanism for why is that important, is lighting up that circuitry, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. And the other thing that strikes me in those discussions is, and there is a spiritual component looping all the way back around, is I'll take it stepwise. I've been fascinated by the selective attention tests, where if you are focused on a task, your brain literally filters out non-task related information. You don't see it, right? The gorilla can walk through and you just do not see that, right? Similarly, I had eye surgery to replace or to add a lens in between my pupil and my natural lens, so to correct my vision. Great surgery, intraocular lens implant, and Key Whitman, great surgeon, so I'll give him a shout out. But one of the interesting effects is that because you have multiple lenses now, off-angle point light sources are often duplicated. So you'll see double vision. Now, the really interesting effect is that seems to only last for about a month because your brain deletes the duplication. It's still hitting your retina, but I do not see duplicated light anymore. I did it first, but my brain decided that wasn't real and just deletes it from my perception. And so now, if I choose to see the duplication, I can. That's the other weird thing. I can actually choose to tune back in, right? All of which is to say, our choice of direction, of what we are intending, what we are expecting maybe, determines what we see, literally.
Yes.
And in terms of opportunities or options, if we are headed somewhere, we can see the things that may get us there or inhibit us from getting there and start solving. If we don't know where we're headed, the moment we hit an obstacle, we decide we must be headed in the wrong direction. Because all we have is an easy, hard perception. We don't have a directionality perception. And most of the work I do with my patients is trying to define which direction they want to go very clearly so that all obstacles are then interpreted in the context of, well, I still have to head that way.
Yes. What you're doing, if I think of this in psychotherapeutic terms, is you're introducing an efficacy-based perspective, right? Let's think intentionally about what's happening around you, directionally. I like that phrase. One of the things that one of the really profound insights of the Stoics, and of course cognitive behavioral psychologists stole it from the Stoics, is that idea that we are not reacting to the world as we go through the course of our life. We're reacting to our perception of the world. And that is, you just described a very physical sense in which that's true, but it's true on every level. We're responding to a set of beliefs we have, a set of assumptions we have about the world, all the way down, that's a higher order cognitive thing, all the way down to more of the just visual perceptual processes. There's a perceptual component right at the start. And that provides very rich ground to be thinking about what a person's options are, because you begin to get into the whole idea of what their beliefs and assumptions are.
And the language I use is that of purpose, of meaningfulness. I think that's that directionality, when it's chosen, when it's it's a choice, provides a sense of meaning and direction, but meaning, purpose, and then allows you to filter out the things that are not that. That filtering also serves the purpose of saying, of limiting the scope of what do I need to pay attention to. But it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the world, especially now with the amount of information that's coming at us. But even without that, maybe even in a natural environment, there's tremendous amounts of information that you could take in, but if it's not relevant to where you're going, it allows your brain to filter and sort of limits the scope. Otherwise, I think just a very existential, kind of going back to the existentialist, it is overwhelming to be in the world if you try not to filter.
Right. That would be, William James, the father of modern psychology, some people would say. He talked about that from a developmental perspective, that when we're infants, life is a great blooming confusion.
Yes.
They don't know that these wiggling pink things in front of them are actually their fingers. They have no idea that they even control them. There's just stimulus around, and development is a process of figuring out what's figure and what's ground. And you start to move up higher order cognitive processes, and then you realize that young toddler is now building a map for how to deal with that world. They've now figured out these are their fingers, those wiggling pink things. Now they're trying to figure out their parents and how do I interact with these people on whom I entirely depend. And you begin to develop a map for how to deal with life. A map which, by the way, tends to lag. It's a lagging indicator. We tend to be going around with the map we have from the last chapter of our life.
Well, and inevitably so to some degree. I mean, our maps are developed in response to experiment and failed experiment, right? So it's always going to lag a little bit behind the experiment I'm currently running. And that goes right back to sense of efficacy and control and choice. Is if I'm trying to make certain choices and it's not working out, am I trying to choose something I don't have control over, or am I not, or do I need to work on technique? It's not always clear. Do I need to try harder, or is this not a choice that's actually, did I misperceive which choices were mine to make?
Yeah. I think that's a very profound kind of underlay to what people experience. I would say, even taking a step back, it's focusing on that experiment, but it's also about avoided experiments. A learned helplessness model, for instance, tells us that, the idea of learned helplessness. If you put a rat in a cage and he's never been in this cage before, and all of a sudden the floor is electrified, right? And so he's trying to avoid it, very agitated. He ends up bumping up against a lever, and the lever closes, and there's no shock. Fairly quickly, he learns to press the lever. And if there's, sometimes they'll do experiments where they have a little light arrangement up in the corner, like a traffic light. When that light moves from green to yellow, the rat learns to press the lever before it even gets to red. And so he never experiences a shock. That rat's learned efficacy. He's learned there are things I can do to move the needle in my life in a good way. And so he's just a perfectly well-adjusted rat in a very strange environment. He's kind of figured out how to do that. Now, here's my point. If you change the wiring, so now he can press the lever all he wants, he's still going to get the shock. He learns helplessness. It's an actively conditioned experience. You learn to be helpless. And my point is, at that point, if you then reverse back to the original conditions, he will never know, because he never tries the lever again. Right? So a good bit of depression, this is the model we use to understand, in large part, to understand depression from a psychological viewpoint and a neurofunctional viewpoint, by the way. But that becomes very profound, is that rat actually has to be, you have to do a lot of extra work to get him back through the learning curve of learning that the lever does work. It isn't that he just goes, oh, well, I guess it works again. No, he's unlearned that behavior. It's actually become a thing to be avoided.
Wow.
So I see that
I'm curious
a great
how
deal
you
in
would
my
with the rat,
patients. How you would what?
No.
Oh, you physically grab their little rat-like hands and you get them to press the lever. You do, or you do, there's something called behavioral chaining. You gradually step him back into it. But it's considerably more effort than with what we call a naive rat.
I think that's really profound, because I've seen that a lot in my patients. Maybe I'll switch over to learned helplessness. The term I've used is a bit more aggressive and probably rubs people the wrong way. You call it victim mindset. That's a bit. I've been searching for a term that's less valenced. So learned helplessness, I think, describes the stance equally well.
I find it's a helpful model because it does kind of emphasize this is something that has been learned. This is your brain actually behaving as designed, right? It's just you hit a situation, right, where that you have that behavioral conditioning has been employed in a way that has moved you into this depressed state. Yeah.
So now I'm curious, are there rats who are sufficiently pig-headed and persistent that they are resistant to this? They just infinitely keep trying to hit the lever? Because I feel like I know people like that just and there's good and bad to it, but they just keep they I don't know, refuse to admit defeat, I guess.
You know, Zain, you may have answered a question for me. I always, even in my grad school days, I always wondered, if you have naive rats, what's the opposite of a naive rat? Maybe it's a pig-headed rat. We'll go with that term. You know, I think what you do find, and I'll just keep my behavioral psychologist operant conditioning hat on, is you find people who are engaged in extinction burst behavior. So extinction bursts, I'll just use a simple example. If every day you go down to the corner and market and you put how many quarters now to get a Coke? You put 8 quarters in to get a Coke, right? Okay. Every day you go and do that. Okay, so quarter inserting behavior has been reinforced, right? So now one day, after a few months of that, you go down and you put the 8 quarters in, you don't get the Coke. Do you just walk away? Most people do not. Most rats in a similar situation would not. Most amoebas would not. They're not getting Cokes, but whatever the amoeba version is. This is something common to organisms.
Wow.
What you get is an extinction burst, and you get generalization, which is to say, with a quarter thing, you put the quarters in 2 or 3 times. Maybe you shake the machine. Maybe you swear at it. Maybe you call the Coke machine company, right? That's all extinction burst and extinction and generalization. So you get that kind of burst, and then it fades, and every now and then you get another little pop of extinction burst. So some of the obstinate people might be in that category. You know, they're engaging in other things to get to the desired behavior. And one thing that I think does... Well, let me put it this way. This is the behavioral explanation that we use for a phenomenon as far away from Coke machines as domestic violence. If you have somebody who's been abusing his wife, she draws some boundaries, maybe she leaves, and he begs her to come back, and she comes back without having set appropriate, kind of conditions, or she caves. Yep. She's teaching him inadvertently, you can still get the Coke, right? You just have to escalate your behavior. And so you get a spiral of domestic violence as a result of that. So if it's reinforced, you will get pig-headed behavior, the way you're talking about, behavior that appears resistant, but there's actually some form of reinforcement occurring.
Well, I mean, I certainly can see that. I guess even I've seen some childhood experiments where, given an unsolvable problem, there is a range of persistence. There's and
I think you're talking about temperament differences. Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely temperamental differences, but I do wonder if that's trainable. Obviously, everyone has a natural set point.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there's trainability to extend beyond that when you realize that part of what may be happening is you have stopped pressing levers, and you need to go out, and you don't know which one may have been turned on, but you got to keep going out and pressing levers, right, until something works, right?
Right.
I'm George Bernard Shaw. I'm fond of his quote that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in attempting to adapt the world to himself, and therefore all progress is the result of the work of the unreasonable man. And there is a bizarre, irrational sort of sense of, well, I will continue pushing any lever until something lets me go the way I want to go. And there's, I don't know, I just, even among my friends, certainly, one of my best friends is by far the most persistent individual I think I've ever met. And I almost struggle to imagine him learning helplessness. I think that the message of his efficacy, and maybe that's a generalized concept, is through his childhood, through whatever, he learned, the learned concept at the abstract level was
Yes.
efficacy.
Yes.
And it's difficult to extinguish that now. It would take, I don't know what it would take.
Yeah.
I would learn, I could learn inefficacy. I can see myself learning helplessness, but I think there are some people who are just so persistent that it.
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know.
You know, I think we are talking about something that's multiply determined. What you're putting me in mind of is just the notion that there are some basic temperament postures that human beings have that vary according to the normal curve, and they're rooted in neurophysiology. For instance, the normal curve variation in terms of what I would call what we call in the neuro world limbic sensitivity. You'll see it in families. There are some families that everybody's a little jittery. Everybody has a bit of a startle response, right? Those kinds of folks, their limbic system is just running hot. You know, it's overly sensitive. Those folks are out of proportion to the general population. They are prone to develop phobias because they're sort of like phobic Velcro. You know, they're going around their world, right, with this fear sort of response, and then something happens that they associate, and now I'm afraid to go to the grocery store, right? Or those are the opposite of the folks you're.
Would those be like Elaine Aron's kind of like highly sensitive people, like that?
Yes,
type of,
exactly,
okay.
exactly. So you can talk about that at the level of.
That's interesting.
You can talk about it at the level of temperament. You can also talk about it at the level of physiology. You can have folks, and this is getting to your point about being resistant to learned helplessness. You can find folks who are limbically insensitive. It takes a lot to get that limbic arousal. Now, these are folks who tend to be people who are more obstinate, you might say. These are also, there's some of these folks are the ones who tend to like jump out of airplanes because they're trying to feel something. You know, they're trying to get some.
Sure.
They're tending not to get a limbic response as they go through the course of their life. So I think there are different subtypes there, both from a neurological standpoint and from a psychological standpoint.
And that's fascinating. I mean, I think that even in a social group, in a tribe, for instance, or evolutionary perspective, you could imagine the value in having people of different types, right? Some people that will persist no matter what, and they will find out if the obstacle can be overcome by beating your head against it enough times. Yep. And then the people who relatively are, you know, they tend to back off more easily from that and try to find some other solution, right?
Yep.
And so, you know, then it's optimized for the tribe survival to say, okay, well, we've got this one group of people that's maybe a little bit less persistent and we'll try to go do other things. Yes. And then we got this group that just going to sit there and beat their head against the rock until it breaks, right?
Right. So we're kind of, I think, circling back in my mind to the underlying role of evolutionary psychology in this, because what you're describing, I think, is accurate. That optimizes for a society or for a tribe, right? But the individuals involved, it may not be optimal for them. Right?
Sure.
So the hunter also is perhaps going to have attentional issues because they've got that limbic overactivation, right? The person who stays home and they're just making soup, you know, we need both of those functions, but they may have some difficulty with limbic underactivation. So you have something that's optimized for the whole, but not necessarily for the individuals. And of course, now to add to that, we live in the 21st century, which is an entirely different thing than a prehistoric society, right? So the demands are different.
Yeah, I am fascinated by, and I'm totally going to butcher this, the IQ effect that requires renormalization of the curve every 10 or 15 years. The name is escaping me. It starts with an F.
Yeah, it'll come to me.
Anyway,
I know what you mean.
But one of the interesting concepts there is that because we live in a modern world that is based on abstractions, in many ways, I think we are optimizing for abstract thinking and intelligence, and people appear to be getting smarter over time. The same IQ test that was normalized at 100 30 years ago, 50 years ago, our 100 would certainly be at 130 back then, and we've had to renormalize because 100's always average, right? But that average seems to be creeping up just as maybe the evolutionary pressure of modern society in some way.
Similarly, maybe perhaps for somewhat different reasons, but the average male is 1.5 feet taller now than in the 1700s. Yeah.
Sure.
Different nutrition.
I find. Yep. Yeah. I guess where I was even going with that is, and now we're totally speculating, so this is unscientific speculation, but hypothesizing maybe more than is we see the adaptation, even a fairly short period of time, for intelligence as the demands of the modern world change. But we maybe, I don't think we see the same rapidity of progression on things like extroversion or things like persistence maybe, or weeding in or weeding out of highly sensitive people. We still have those bell curves, which to some degree would imply, or conservatism, if we're talking about like left versus right, the personality characteristics that lead you to be more conservative or more sort of open. The fact that those have not budged maybe is in itself perhaps a bit interesting, and implies that we need the range as a species. We still evolutionarily perceive the need to have both conservative and liberal elements, to have both introverted and extroverted elements, in maybe ways we don't quite perceive.
That's interesting you would say that. One of the things I did my master's project in grad school on something called cognitive complexity. Not sure if you and I have talked about this. It's basically the idea that human beings vary, normal curve, and it has not changed since the 60s when this research was done. Human beings vary in terms of the need for the degree of ambiguity that they can tolerate. So someone who's very cognitively
I am
complex,
familiar with this a little bit,
Yeah, versus people who are relatively cognitively simple. So that is what that's tended to reflect. This started, by the way, with a psychologist named Gordon Allport, who was a psychologist in the 60s, who was a Christian. And he became pretty alarmed with research he saw around prejudice. There was a lot of research on prejudice in those days. And the research said that churchgoers were more prejudiced than the average population. So Allport was a Christian. That troubled him. So like a good scientist, he wanted to go study that. And first thing he found was, okay, we're measuring churchgoers. So let's see what goes into churchgoers. What's going on with the folks who go to church. This has, by the way, been replicated in various religions and denominations. What he found was there was a small group that was what he called indiscriminately pro-religious. If it was spiritual, if it involved meaning, they were for it. Kind of the folks who are into crystals and they're into, whatever, they kind of wanted it.
Yeah.
But the two larger groups were what he called intrinsically religious. And these are the people who were attending church because it had an intrinsic meaning to them. Okay, these are the folks who would have gone to church if it cost them something, right? So meaning, purpose, value, service, those kind of, larger values were kind of what drove them. What he found, to his chagrin, was that approaching a majority, it was a plurality of the study he was using, were extrinsically religious. By which what that was referring to is I go to church because it's good for my kids, or it's a good place to meet people, or I get to go and be with people that I agree with. Okay, so that was the 60s, and we've been through the great sort since, and we have a breakdown that is pretty similar to back in the 60s. And I may be stepping into a little controversy here, but about 25% of the American population tends to shade into a significantly extrinsically religious approach. And the next step in the research was to look at that, at least in part, as having to do with cognitive complexity. Because you have some people who they actually embrace shades of gray. They're not comfortable with simple answers, and that can be a problem. But you also have folks on the other end of the continuum who embrace black or white answers. I've been talking about this long enough that I would originally use the metaphor or the illusion of Archie Bunker in All in the Family. It was kind of an all or nothing, black or white kind of worldview. A bit stereotypical, but that's kind of what that side is looking for. So what you're looking at is actually folks who may be clothing things in terms of religion, but it has at one level to do with sort of actually an affective need for certainty. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And that's a whole other thing, actually, than at least the way I would understand faith. Religion can accommodate that. It can accommodate either the very simple or the very complex, I suppose, depending on what denomination you're pursuing. But that, I think, is a really interesting dynamic to think about religiosity in.
That is fascinating. So, brief aside for humor, not interest, but the way I came across that literature actually was there were some follow-up studies implying that certain medical specialties were chosen on the basis of your capacity for complexity. So famous, not complexity, but your tolerance of uncertainty.
Yes,
was the way it was phrased. And so internists were the highest, sort of very comfortable with uncertainty. And then, orthopedic surgeons and interestingly, oncologists were not super thrilled with uncertainty. I was a bit surprised by that. But there was a definite striation in the personality type in that regard. How much can you tolerate uncertainty?
Right.
So yeah, that was my introduction to that field. Just the pervasive sort of mocking of orthopedic surgeons by internists was, and vice versa. I'm sure. I'm not in those. I'm not in those discussions, but I'm sure it cuts the other way as well.
Right. Somewhat parallel in psychology. Psychotherapists tend to be highly tolerant of uncertainty and ambiguity. Research psychologists tend not to be. Which also, in having this conversation, it can sound like this could, in some contexts, map to political affiliations. We seem to be living in an era when that's kind of always where we go. It's not necessarily the case. You can be like a research psychologist isn't politically affiliated, but they can have very simple, kind of, it's either this or it's this. Yeah. Sure.
I did see some data from OkCupid, actually. They did an amalgamation that said that your self-reported preference for complexity or simplicity was the strongest predictor of whether you would be more or less conservative than your region. So it was regional. And if you're in a very liberal region, you would still be pretty liberal on a global scale, but you would be more conservative than the rest of your region. It was an interesting analysis.
That is interesting. Yeah. My respect for OkCupid just went up a little bit. That's interesting.
They've had some fun. They've had some fun research, I will say. I think that was before they got purchased by Match.com. But so looping, I do want to tie this back around, and we probably won't get to ritual, but I do want to kind of tie this back around to our previous comments on efficacy and spirituality, in that I think that the spiritual stance that we've talked about, even for neurofeedback, is kind of being engaged in the process, in the problem solving, perceiving efficacy, but maybe not immediate efficacy, maybe not godlike efficacy. I cannot in the context of neurofeedback, I cannot force my brain into high alpha. I cannot just decide that's what I'm going to do. But I'm borrowing from Spirituality of Imperfection again, I can be open to the miracle of high alpha and allow that to come upon me. And that is a choice. Choosing to open the door is a choice. I can't force it to come in the house.
Yes.
But I can open the door. And sleep is similar, I think. I think it's one of the reasons we struggle with sleep culturally, is it is an everyday miracle in some sense, right? You can be open to it. You cannot just you can decide to go to bed. You can't decide to go to sleep.
Exactly.
And it's an interesting thing is to choose the things that are within your capacity for choosing. I can choose not to look at my phone. I can choose not to eat too late. I can choose to exercise. I can choose to do all these things that will keep the door as open as it can be for sleep to come in. But whether it does or not is a sort of nightly miracle. You just have to let it. Either it happens or it doesn't, and you're not in control of that. And you have to let go of control. I think all the attempts at gaining control pharmaceutically, part of the reason they go so horribly wrong and increase risk of death, very addictive for those reasons, is because you are attempting to control things that are not yours to control.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And even if you succeed and it knocks you out, it compels you to go to sleep, pretty good chance it's going to interfere with the sleep cycle.
No, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it worsens the quality of your sleep. Interestingly, so Ambien is my favorite punching bag in these regards, but it reduces quality of sleep, does not meaningfully increase duration of sleep. It increases your risk of death by almost three times if you're taking even more than 8 doses a year or something like that, some absurdly low dose.
Yeah.
And if you take it every day for 10 days in a row, it stops working.
Yeah.
It actually has no... In those 10 days, the only effect is it speeds up your time to fall asleep. Right? So it is treating your anxiety about whether I'm going to fall asleep or not, because it speeds it up. And other than that, has only worsening effects or no effects. And then that stops, except that then if you stop taking it, the primary withdrawal side effect is insomnia. It's just a phenomenal
Other than that,
recipe
it's great.
Other than that, it's great. Correct.
You just listed 2 or 3 reasons that would just keep me up at night, worrying about if I had just taken some Ambien.
Sure.
It's interesting. I'm going to take a step back and circle back around to sleep because it's such a great example of what we're getting at. I work a lot with folks who are coming to me for performance enhancement. These are executives or even homemakers or anyone who's trying to raise their game. And what is interesting to me, almost universally with them, I have to have a conversation that in my mind is a spiritual conversation. And that is, just to pick up on what we started with in our conversation today, is the idea that you have learned some phenomenal skills for how to move the needle out there in the world, right? You've learned how to kind of lean in to get things done, out in the world. That's good for about 90% of life, right? That if you're an entrepreneur and you've figured out how to get your employees to give that extra 10% by pushing them, maybe a combination of carrots and sticks, all the kind of things you do to kind of compel change, that's right out on the edge of anything you can control. That's all very cool. Yeah. How's that working with your wife? If you come home and you're trying to, do that, you start to realize there are limits to that form of strength. And so often with those folks, I'm having to really lean into them with the idea that you have to learn a different form of strength. And this is not the limbically driven strength, or rather the sympathetic nervous system form of strength, the form of strength that is rooted in the fight or flight response. We're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system, that form of strength, which has to do with stepping back, down-regulating. Because you know what, when we upregulate, when we upregulate that limbic system and we're in fight or flight, A number of things happen that are good if you're being chased by a bear. But if you're in the 21st century,
Yes.
those very same things, they make you stupid. When we're more anxious, we get stupid. We lose our ability for creative thought. We lose our capacity for concentration. We lose our ability to emotionally regulate effectively. We forget some of the behaviors we've learned, perhaps, for how to deal effectively in relationship. All those things happen when you're in that sympathetic side, and you have to learn the other side, the other form of strength. Now, to my way of thinking, a number of things come into play when you open that door. One is, what triggers fight or flight? A threat, perception of threat. What triggers the parasympathetic response? A couple of things. One is the absence of threat, or at least receding from threat, so it's not imminent. Secondly, building up cues that remind you, that tell you at a very deep level, this is the time you can downregulate. And that's where ritual and tradition, rhythm, ritual, routine come in.
Yes.
So for my way of experiencing this, and I struggle with getting time to do this in my day like anyone, but having that 15, 20 minutes at least in the morning where I can sit and there are just certain things I do that I try and do the same way every day. And all of those become these powerful cues to activate that parasympathetic nervous system, right, to downregulate. And what I find is I become more creative if I give myself time for that. What I find is, to pick up the previous conversations, I start becoming aware of possibilities I wasn't aware of when I was in the fight or flight, that kind of convergent thinking.
Yeah.
I can become more convergent or divergent in my thinking. So, I think those things are ways the mind can cooperate with the brain to produce that downregulated parasympathetic nervous system response that in turn can lead to the kind of creativity and meaning focus that we lack if we never exit the fight or flight response.
You had like 4 threads that I attempted to pick up there.
We're making a quilt.
The low-hanging fruit, yeah. The low-hanging fruit there, I guess, to some degree, is that idea of ritual. I've been thinking a bit about that, but I feel like I've come to realize, even because I am natively one of those high limbic people, right?
Yeah.
Highly sensitive. Across the board, her description hit me exactly, But through medical training, I, had to practice tolerating absurdly elevated situations.
Yes.
And kind of developed mini rituals, I think, to downregulate myself beat by beat in real time.
Yes.
For instance, I've really come to realize that taking a sip of coffee is a mini ritual that downregulates me. And I had sort of trained myself, and I walk around the hospital holding a hot cup of coffee. And the reason I even noticed this is because during pandemic, we all had masks on, and I couldn't walk around with my coffee anymore. And my hospital shifts were even more stressful just because I had lost my ritual.
Your ritual. Right.
And I was famous for famous. I was known in residency for running a code. Somebody would be code blue. We're doing CPR. We're doing all this, and I'd be in the back running the code with sipping a cup of coffee. And part of the reason was refusal to allow sympathetic overload. It was like, nope.
Yes.
We're going to address this parasympathetically.
Yes.
And as the team leader, I need to be thinking and seeing broadly. I need the broad scope. I can't get locked in.
Exactly.
I need to be thinking diagnostically. How did this happen? What is going on here? Why did we end up here? Because that may tell us how to get out of it. But if you're too locked in, you can't think that way. So even it doesn't even have to be 15, 20 minutes if you train it under sufficiently stressful circumstances, I suppose. But that's a really fascinating idea. The other related threads that popped up is that Eastern philosophy has some of these. So, Tao Te Ching is way of ultimate power, right? And it is very much here's the parasympathetic version of power, right? Or I think it's called Wu Wei.
Yes.
It's sort of like non-passive waiting. It's waiting as an active choice of what is the best thing I could do in the situation. And in medicine in particular, this is a hard one culturally with patients here, is often the best possible thing we could do is nothing.
Yep.
And I know everyone wants there to be a something that is better than nothing, but in the vast majority of cases, waiting, and then if there is a moment of intervention, we can hit that moment and intervene, and it will take far less effort than trying to strain against the situation.
And your intervention could be a soft intervention, right? It could be reinforcing to them that you're not going to die. Here are the few tips on breathing, for instance, and that's going to downregulate your panic attack or whatever it might be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting to try to, and it is, I think the reason that you had mentioned it as a form of strength, I would have used the term power, I guess, but it is a power. And reperceiving that as not only sympathetic activities are powerful. Parasympathetic activities have their own power that is in some ways deeper and more pervasive. The Tao Te Ching uses the image of kind of rock versus tide, or but that water, that patient flowing kind of power that just the tide pushes in and it is inexorable even by the strongest rock, right?
Yes. Zain, what you're reminding me of here is some really interesting work that's been done in organizational systems. There's some theorists who come out of actually the family systems world who talk about what it means to be a non-anxious presence in an organization. And their idea is that whether it's families or business organizations, hospitals, they are systems that organize around anxiety, which is a very different thing than what we usually think about. Picture the last time you're in a meeting and there's just a great deal of tension, right? And what I would notice, it can be 100 different ways this plays out, but you may find that the people in that room are working to reduce the anxiety of the leader. The leader's upset about something, so everybody kind of moves to reduce anxiety. That's the emotional systems idea in family psychology. I could tell you some stories in family therapy, for instance, where you get mom and dad have a conflict between each other and they're not really able to deal with it well. All of a sudden, one of the kids becomes to act out. So he becomes the identified problem. But the role that serves is it diverts all the energy onto him away from the conflict between mom and dad. You see what I'm saying? So I'm really compressing this idea that there are anxiety dynamics in organizations of any kind that revolve around anxiety. And what so often happens in a dysfunctional organization is the members are simply reacting to the pressures to reduce overall anxiety as opposed to choosing a response. So these researchers, Edwin Friedman would be one. He's no longer living. This is a gentleman who started out as a rabbi and then became a family systems therapist and ended up doing organizational consulting with the Pentagon. So he had quite a wide range of the Pentagon and synagogues and churches. Those were kind of his three big kinds of clients. And he would talk about being a non-anxious presence and what it means to be a non-anxious presence, where you're aware of the anxiety, right? So that would be that idea of engaging, but not trying to fix it, not trying to control it, right? And that notion of being a non-anxious presence is very powerful. It can be difficult to get there. I can tell you some stories about ways one might get there. But when you get there, I'm going to link this actually to free will, believe it or not. We're getting there. We're at the clubhouse turn here. If you're able to be a non-anxious presence, what does that do? it can help other people downregulate.
Yes.
And if they can downregulate, this is now going to turn the free will question on its head. You improve their capacity for free will and free choice.
Yes.
That was the big aha for me, that the most important part of the question about free will and free choice is not, do I have it, but what can I do so that you can have it? Because the more you're able to recognize the full span of choices available to you, in general, that is going to be better for me, right? It's certainly going to be better for you. It's a gift that I would give us both.
Yes. And that is, in some way, some of the deep power of that parasympathetic stimulus is it does push out. I would resonate with that. In fact,
doesn't oxytocin, one of the triggers for oxytocin, it's a parasympathetically driven hormone,
It is
not?
parasympathetically driven. I've moved away from a neurotransmitter model. I'm frustrated by that.
Okay.
Anyway, that's a whole story on itself.
Anyway, a whole other story. Okay.
Yeah, I will say, I think, one of the big triggers for seeing who I wanted to be and kind of this coffee sipping sort of mentality was in residency very, very early. I saw two of my mentors run a code, and they just had poise as they walked in. Because everybody had been running around like chickens with their head cut off and screaming and this and that. They walked in, and the entire room dropped into perfect precision, calm. Everything worked flawlessly the moment they arrived, just because that they walked in with that presence of, hey, we're not going to be responding to anxiety. We're going to figure this out. It's going to be okay.
That's transformative.
That's something I've always wanted.
Yes.
What's that?
Yes. That's transformative. And you with your coffee, you are having the same effect, I'm sure. Yeah.
I have a crutch. I have a coffee crutch. That's I'm still working on pulling it fully into myself, but it's in my hand at least. I've gotten it that close.
That's right. That's right. Well, and the benefit we're talking here offsets any stimulative effects of the caffeine, I'm assuming.
Correct. Apparently so. That's kind of the interesting thing. Yeah.
Right. This conversation to me becomes a spiritual conversation
I know it is.
Because it's about stepping out of the situation. It's about stepping out of the situation and giving it context.
So for you, that stepping out of is in itself maybe a spiritual. I'm trying to understand the connection.
Yeah. So for me, when I use the term spiritual, I'm not referring to any particular, creed or denomination or anything along those lines. To my way of thinking, I would generally equate the idea of spirituality with the idea of transcendence. And all I mean by transcendence, it means a lot of things to a lot of people, is the ability to have a superordinate context. That's what the social psychologists would call it, right? Something larger than oneself.
Sure.
That is perhaps one of the most powerful down-regulating, parasympathetically stimulating experiences we can have to recognize there's a larger context. I just had a therapy session with a gentleman a little while ago whose wife is dying under very difficult circumstances, and I'm doing psychotherapy with him. And there's nothing to be done for her, done in the sense of, some kind of procedures like you're talking about. It's the idea of being present with. And he's looking for and finding transcendence. He's looking actively for ways to kind of incorporate her memory. He's already anticipating, her being gone, and ways to incorporate. He's, videotaping some interviews with her so that their grandkids can see them. That sort of thing. Yeah. Something like that, can give a very powerful superordinate meaning. Frankl, Viktor Frankl, we've had this conversation, Man's Search for Meaning. That's what he was, one of his great insights, I think, was the dynamic for people who survived the concentration camp experience. The ones who psychologically survived the best were the ones who found something larger or something other than themselves to focus on. And sometimes it wasn't grand. There's a story of a gentleman who was put in a little confined cage. He was, in solitary. He couldn't even straighten out. He had very little control over his life. He found and befriended and trained a cockroach. And that became his world, right? So it might sound a little funny to call that transcendence, but he found something other than his situation. Yep. And he wasn't unscathed, but he came out of that experience, psychologically intact in a way that others did not, who were not able to find that other context. So.
Yeah, that idea of transcendence is an interesting one because, I think we maybe dance around that. We use terms like meaning and purpose and fulfillment, and those are great. Nothing wrong with those, but those are transcendent ideas, perhaps, inherently. I think, I think I dance around that transcendent aspect sort of to warm people up from our current cultural context into to sort of pull them in.
Yes.
But, there is that idea of, in all the meanings and purposes that I see and find, there is something transcendent, I think. And I've sort of started, part of my practice, I've been delineating the categories of things that people find meaningful, and I don't think there are that many. I think we're all human, and I think there's a limited number of things that humans find meaningful. But as you say this, I think there is a transcendent element to each of them in a different way. That's maybe something I need to incorporate more of. Maybe you got to warm people up, but pull them maybe a little further that way.
A little further, and different people need different language, to understand it.
Of course.
The neuroscience part of me just always wants to remember in this conversation that we are the primates with the big frontal lobes. We're the ones that develop these frontal lobes, and their purpose is to develop mental models, right? At its most fundamental, it's to develop a mental model that will allow me not just to be prey of the saber-toothed tiger, but to maybe with my buddies go and hunt him down, right? Or to develop a model of the weather that says that we better be storing up grain because we've got indicators there's a famine. Mental models help us with survival, but then we get these capacities, and there's more, right? There is this piece about having context that I think our frontal lobes yearn for, if you will, if I'm not anthropomorphizing the frontal lobes. We're looking for something that has some kind of meaning. Different people to different degrees and in different ways.
One of my most influential books is the book Dune, and one of the quotes there is, deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a universe that makes sense. But the real universe is always one step beyond logic. and there's an interesting tension there that we want to form mental models, and yet inevitably any model is not the thing. The map is not the territory, right?
Yes.
And so inevitably you realize that the territory, the nature of reality transcends your model. And that can be a source of anxiety, or if you are, and maybe that's the value of a transcendent state or a spiritual stance, is that you're no longer challenged by that difference, by that. It's not a tension anymore. It's a known and beloved fact in some ways. And so when you run into those situations where the map does not adequately guide you, you're okay with kind of wandering in the dark.
Yeah, and I think it's a very it varies so much from person to person as to what the frame of their transcendence is going to be. I think that's absolutely true. Sure. It does not have to be explicitly religious. I know many people who are atheists, but they are committed themselves around maybe an ethic of service or something like that, and that's how they find meaning.
Yeah, there's an interest. Yeah, I had a recent one of my other best friends in Austin, has recently been kind of struggling with this and kind of come to some conclusions, and has been an atheist for a very long time. And I tease him that he's found God again, which he resists and still, says that he's an atheist. But there is some truth to the idea that if you adhere to a transcendent value, then whatever that is serves the purpose of God for you. And so, who said there's a God-shaped hole in man's heart?
Pascal.
Okay, yeah.
Pascal,
and
yeah.
So, yeah. And so, whatever you fill that with is serving that function,
Right.
and can be called by that name,
Right.
as far as I'm concerned.
So Pascal, he's a very interesting figure. He also developed what's called Pascal's wager. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think that's
yes.
relevant here. It's the idea that he's framing it in a Christian context, but even if you don't believe that there's a God and that that the Christian faith is true, act as if it is, because the worst thing that will happen is you'll live a really satisfying life, full of love and service. I guess unless you're on one of the Crusades or something like that. That's a bit of fine print we won't focus on right now.
Sure.
And then you'll die, and that will be the end of it. But you will have had a meaningful life. That's kind of the essence of that. And I think you can go a step even further with that around what is your ethic. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we could keep going down the rabbit hole, but I didn't want to leave us a little bit of time after, so maybe
you bet.
Call it there.
Zain, I want to read one little quote here that might be useful.
Yeah, please.
In this. It's something you may have seen. I have it at the end of my emails. It's from Viktor Frankl, and it says, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom."
Yes, I love that quote. That is...
Yeah. Hopefully, to
essence
some
of
degree,
that
we're
statement.
illuminating that a bit today.
Absolutely.